Hello, everybody. I know there's folks still arriving, but I'll get started. Welcome back to the 2023 Climate Resilience Training for Oregon Agriculture Professionals. My name is Carly Boyer. I'm a program manager at Oregon Climate and Agriculture Network, and I've been working to bring this three-part series together over the past 5 months with my planning team. You all know who you are. Thank you again for all of your support. We are in our third year, and we are so grateful to host this series again, thanks to the Western SARE. People are joining us today from all over the state of Oregon and even beyond. We welcome you here today. We are joining together as technical service providers, researchers, farmers, ranchers, and generally people who share a passion for climate resilience on Oregon farms. Our workshop goals are to create a community of practice supporting climate resilience on farms and ranches in Oregon and to strengthen our statewide network and deepen regional relationships. I'm going to talk about, oh, never mind. My prompt's so messed up. We're going to go back and pass it off to Jessie.
Thanks, Carly. I'd just like to introduce our speaker, Berit Dinsdale. Berit began her career with OSU Extension Services as a graduate student in 2017, assisting faculty in developing effective educational programming for their stakeholders. Since 2021, she has been conducting needs assessments with Oregon farmers and ranchers to help inform extension outreach efforts, as well as provide lawmakers with essential data on how they can best support Oregon's agriculturalists. Her current role is continuing the development and execution of agricultural needs assessments, while also supporting the OSU Extension Water Cluster team in planning and developing water-related programming for stakeholders across the state. I'll turn it over to you, Berit.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. So as Jessie said, my name is Berit Dinsdale, and I'm going to be sharing my project with you today, or our project rather. It took a village to do this. And this is very cool that I'm seeing so many faces in here that actually helped contribute to this project. So that's really neat. And just, before I even start, thank you guys for all of the work that you put into this. And without further ado, I'll get started. So I have this really short title here that rolls off the tongue, but our project is called Beating the Heat, a statewide assessment of drought and heat mitigation practices and needs with Oregon farmers and ranchers. So the project supervisors, I would like to give them a shout out because they were so supportive and helpful, is Abigail Tomaszek, who's with Crop and Soil Science, and Maria Zamora-Ray, who's with BEE. And I'll just jump right into it. So excuse me. There we go. Okay, so the outline for today. So I'll talk a little bit first just about the project request. So where did this project come from? What were we asked to do? I'll spend a little bit of time on our process overview. The reason being a lot of folks are really interested in how you do a needs assessment. So I just want to give people kind of a taste of that. I'm always happy to talk more about this outside of the bounds of this presentation as well. So less methods oriented, because I know why you're all here, which is mostly to hear about the outcomes. So, I've listed them as on farm and off farm. I think everyone here is very aware that those things are, overlapping and influence one another. But just organizationally, we'll kind of talk about them in those two capacities. So to start with, what was the project request? So if you are in Oregon or in the Pacific Northwest, you'll remember that in 2020, we had that heat dome, and that really terrified all of us, I think. So a follow-up December 2021 special legislative session was held to talk about different kind of emergency responses to drought and heat and climate challenges. And out of this session came a bipartisan request from Rep. Helms and Owens to do a statewide drought and heat needs assessment. The request focused more on fresh market producers, but it was really all encompassing. So all commodities, all regions, all farm sizes. And the two questions that they were interested in were, what are farmers doing on farm already to deal with drought and heat? And then also, what would they like to be able to do moving forward? The idea being that then they could use this information to kind of make choices moving forward about where to orient support and finances and things like that. So our process to complete this project was a 3-phase approach. So we started with the pre-assessment. I was hired in July to do this. And as I'm sure you know, July is not a great time to start asking farmers to work with you on projects. So we use that time to plan and to start kind of reaching out to you lovely folks and other folks that have expertise on climate and drought issues. Phase 2 is the actual assessment. And then finally, phase 3 was the post-assessment, which was data analysis. And I'll focus mostly again on this last phase today. But to start with, because this is partially where a lot of you came in, we did our pre-assessment. So we surveyed extension faculty. We also used a platform called Digital Measures, which is where faculty self-report projects that they're working on. And we use those 2 tools to identify who's already doing work with farmers on drought and heat. It's really important when you do a needs assessment to talk to your community, but it's also important to talk to people that have been doing this work longer than you have and that might know things that you don't know. So we started with that process. We did find from those 2 measures that there were at least 38, and I'm here to say that that's kind of a minimum, 38 faculty that are working on drought and heat related projects, which is a really good chunk. It was really important for us, though, to know how many were working directly with stakeholders, and we identified about 11 faculty that had really active engagement from their producers. External to OSU, we worked with ORCAN, Friends of Family Farmers, OCFSN, the law school, various soil and water conservation districts, both to get some background, because again, this was statewide. We were doing this project, I should have mentioned this, a statewide assessment in about 9 months. So we had a very short timeline to get this done. So it was really important that we kind of called upon our allies to give us some background information, get some details about, specifics to things like Central Oregon or coastal. What are the major issues people are dealing with? So that was our pre-assessment phase. Phase 2 was doing the actual assessment. So we were actually in about 7 months able to complete 59 interviews and 3 farm visits. And we did those phone, in person, and Zoom. They were each about 1 to 2 hours and were recorded. We did have more limited engagement from the coast and east, as you can see in figure 1. I just like to point that out because that is a weakness of this assessment. I think it's important to acknowledge that we could have gotten more participants from those regions. But again, I think if you've been working in this industry for a while, Eastern, there's less folks, ideologically and geographically more remote from Corvallis, makes it a little bit harder to recruit. But that was something that we would have liked to see more of, but generally pretty good distribution in other parts of the state. And I also wanted to point out that we had good representation from fairly large growers, large as in quotation marks, because these are really my categorizations. Usually I think it's calculated using like gross cash farm income. That was more personal than we wanted to get with people. We just wanted a general sense of how big their operations were, how much land they were kind of stewarding. And we had about 19 folks that were working on over 1,000 acres. So pretty good representation there. I wasn't necessarily going to include this, but our group actually talked about this last week because it's important. I think it's interesting to share is that I think a lot of the time when we're doing climate type work, it can feel harder to access what I would consider larger growers. But when we calculated total acreage, across the project, those 19 producers were accountable for about 95% of land stewardship, if you look at the proportion of the whole. I think that's really important because I think it just is a reminder to keep encouraging us to try to engage larger scale commercial farmers that we might feel like maybe are not ideologically on the same page in terms of like climate work or sustainability. But it's just really important to keep, try to keep developing those bridges and relationships over time. So very briefly, because I get questions about this a lot, how do you do the analysis of 60 interviews? The answer is with a lot of patience and student help, because it's really boring. But you basically transcribe all of your interviews, and then you go through every single interview and start pulling out kind of common themes and code. So I just like to show this to people because it's novel for a lot of folks. But these kind of categories, these codes ended up being our main outcome categories. So that's kind of what that looks like. Again, this is kind of quick and dirty, maybe not interesting to some of you, but some of you might find it of interest, and I'm happy to talk about this more at a different time. So before I jump into the outcomes, just a couple things to keep in mind about the way this assessment is structured is that first and foremost, all outcomes are grounded in the participants' experiences and suggestions. I like to just focus on that because sometimes folks will say, well, I read in the report or I've seen other places that people are really interested in, energy efficiency, but like we have programs for that. And my response to that is that if people are still saying they need help with energy efficiency, that might be a communication problem, right? Or a marketing problem in terms of getting that information out there. So the resource might be available and you're thinking we don't need to work on that. But if someone says, hey, we really need that, then that's something that we also need to think about is just how do we communicate better what's available. I also like to point out not all participants' opinions are the same. So what is presented here is where we had the most input and the highest frequency. I would really encourage you to go back to the full report though, because sometimes the most interesting or creative solutions are not the most frequently cited ones. And so the report does include some of those kind of ideas or solutions that maybe only one or two people presented. So these are kind of the bigger overarching ideas, but they're certainly not comprehensive. So just to keep in mind as we go through that. Okay, in terms of on-farm outcomes, so the way that I've kind of structured this today is to talk about irrigation systems folks are using, their management of irrigation and ecosystems, their soil systems, and then their commodities. Again, these are not perfect categories, but they just help in terms of, organization and thinking about it. But of course, they do cross over one another. So on-farm irrigation systems. So mostly, folks are pretty aware of what the higher efficiency irrigation systems are. So if you take a look at drip, 41% of folks were using drip, and a lot of people had multiple pieces in the system, right? So they were using drip in some areas and overhead in others. So that was good to see is that people, if they could use drip, were using it. Higher efficiency irrigation systems like LIPA and LISA, a little bit less common, but people were pretty aware of them. When you get down into low application efficiency, and I just want to point this out in particular because it's relevant to what we'll talk about later, but unspecified overhead or hand lines or wheel lines were also very common. This generally was not because people didn't understand that they weren't as efficient. It was mostly because they needed things like cooling, overhead cooling, or overhead frost protection. And so they'd say, yeah, I'd love to put everything on drip. I just can't because it's going to be too much of a risk for my crop. So there were some interventions that folks were thinking of in terms of, making what they had to use more efficient if they couldn't do something like upgrade to drip. Okay. So on-farm irrigation systems, and I used to teach public speaking, and old me is like, there's too much text on this slide, but this is like the condensed version of the condensed version. So any more condensed, and I wouldn't be able to share that much with you guys, but I do apologize that there's a lot of text to look at, and I'll try to keep it as interesting as possible. But so some of the main actions that people were using vis-a-vis their irrigation systems was to upgrade to a higher or medium potential application efficiency system from a low, managing their energy costs, and also working on things like water storage. Cost, unsurprisingly, it was a major challenge for people in this regard. And so some potential solutions were things like adjusting your cost sharing parameters to account for increasing inflation and input costs. Collaborating with power companies. People were very aware of energy trust and things like variable frequency drives, but they would have liked to see something taken a step further. Companies I know like Y East are working on initiatives like this to help with energy costs. And then also with water storage cost would be to help with subsidizing or investing in cost share programs that help people build water storage in some capacity. Of course, then you do get into some policy issues around water rights and can you store water and how much can you store? And that's quite complicated for a lot of folks. So there were, again, some requests to maybe reevaluate rules and regulations to kind of ease the process of storing water in the rainy season when there's more precipitation. So next was irrigation management. So what are people doing with their management styles to account for drought and heat pressure? So some of the more kind of prevalent activities were applying water to reduce heat impact. Of course, when we have more drought, we often have more heat. And so trying to cool down your crops with more limited water is extremely challenging, right? So that's something that people are doing, but it's not a perfect solution. Folks also said that they would like to be able to drop their wells deeper or dig new wells. And then there was also a call for increasing off-farm infrastructure development, like large-scale reservoirs. Some obstacles in this regard, though, were things like water access and efficacy. So one of the issues that I know a lot of you are aware about is when we talk about things like grants, a lot of time equipment is not available. You're not allowed to fund things like fencing, which for like rotational grazing or actual, structures. But shade structures are something that especially fresh market producers were really interested in. Here in the Valley, berry producers were actually spending upwards of, $1 million looking into shade structures because they feel like they don't have very many options anymore. When it came to dropping or digging new wells, obviously this is a huge policy hurdle. So this actually relates a little bit to the data category that I'll talk about later as an off-farm improvement that could be made. Folks would like more accurate or better communicated data about things like water availability. So it wouldn't necessarily be a solution, but I think it would foster better relationships between policymakers, regulatory groups, and farmers if farmers felt like how much water is available and why they can't, drop a new well or put in water storage. It would maybe help them feel a little bit better about those calls. And then with off-farm infrastructure, it had to do with continuing supported ongoing mediated conversations between different groups that have vested interest in things like, building ponds or building reservoirs. The next category was ecosystem management and fire mitigation. This is a smaller category, not because it's more simple, but because it's so complex. And so when folks would talk about, I just want the, ecosystem management to be better, they were very often talking about things like improving forestry practices. That was especially true in places like Southern Oregon. They felt like a lot of the on-farm strategies that I'm using don't really matter when, the forests are dying or burning up, and that's threatening my property. Which linked to that, which I've also included here, is fire mitigation. So actions people are taking, establishing and protecting forests that are nearby, on-farm tree plantings, and establishing riparian areas as ecosystem management practices. In terms of what's needed for that, though, however, it would be more research and a lot more engagement on just kind of how do you work at an ecosystem level. Again, that's very vague, but people had a lot of questions about, how does the forest impact my on-farm drought and heat resilience? So more information on that would be useful. And with fire, creating defensible spaces, but how do you do that without water, right? Especially in places where we have a lot of wildfire, water is really limited. So what are some ways that folks can have cost-effective solutions to protect their properties in these really dramatic fire situations? Okay, everyone doing okay? Information overload from a fire hose. All right, soil management. Whoa, baby. This is a big category, as I'm sure you know, because soil is everything, and producers are really aware of that. So this is a little bit more of a busy slide just for that very reason, right? So some of the main activities folks were using to manage soil as a drought and heat resilience activity: mulching and composting, reducing and no-till, soil moisture monitoring, cover cropping, and rotational grazing. Just for time's sake, I can't go through every single point here. These are available to you on the story map that Carly kindly dropped into the chat. But a lot of the issues with soil came back to things, especially for smaller scale producers, but for larger scale as well, of lack of access to appropriate equipment. So if you only have a couple acres, it might not be worthwhile for you to get a no-till drill, for example, right? There are some really great programs out there that will rent equipment. And there was some call to expand those programs to other soil and water conservation districts. I have it here. Yamhill and Clack, for example, both do offer that equipment. Mulching and composting, folks had said, we don't know where to get the resources from. Maybe there could be some seed funding for businesses that provide, leaf litter to farmers for, really cheap. So kind of accessing more affordable mulch and compost inputs. And soil moisture monitoring. This one was pretty interesting to us because it's something that we've talked about in extension for a little while. Folks are aware of soil moisture monitoring as a strategy. However, the cost of the equipment, installing them all over the property, if you have a lot of variability, it can be very expensive. But one of the main things that I wanted to draw attention to was the data interpretation. I think we all know this, that we have a very narrow window of time when you're farming, and being able to sit down, look at data, and then create actionable items is not something that a lot of farmers can do or want to do. So we can give people data, but we also need to give them tools and strategies on how to interpret and use that data, right? And how to actually do something with it that makes sense for them. Similarly with cover cropping, people are familiar with cover cropping, but in their particular climate, in their particular soil type, with the amount of precipitation that they get, what are the best practices? And pulling all of those pieces together can be really challenging and time consuming. And then again, with that rotational grazing component, subsidizing things like equipment would have been really helpful for people in terms of boosting their soil health, using kind of their on-farm practices. Okay, so commodity management, and I'll try to go quickly. So we've got selecting new cultivars, selecting new varieties, and sometimes even transitioning to new crops. This was something that smaller scale farmers were a little bit more open to, just because larger scale producers felt like it was just too risky. Turning over crops to something else was just going to be a massive financial investment that felt a little bit too scary. Shading and other non-irrigation cooling strategies, again, back to that piece of subsidizing equipment if possible. And then also adjusting planting and harvest time to shoulder seasons. So instead of doing things in the middle of summer, can you start your plantings a little bit earlier in the season? Can you harvest a little bit later? Again, back to infrastructure. A lot of the time, having infrastructure to protect your crops in those shoulder seasons is really helpful. So super quickly, off-farm outcomes, 3 major categories: data, funding, and policy. So where are people getting their data at the moment? I'm not just saying this because I'm with Extension, but a lot of folks get their information from Extension. And then, as everyone I think in this group knows, farmer to farmer information networks, so important. What are some of the main obstacles here? Again, with Extension, sometimes the data is not locally specific, which, it's a little too vague for people to actually use, or it's a bit outdated, right? I think if we've lived in Oregon for a while, we've seen climate change rapidly, and we haven't necessarily kept a pace with that. And people are a little nervous about that, right? Like, if climate's changing, how am I supposed to be, adapting? What should I be doing? So one potential solution for that is to do things like financed on-farm trials. When farmers can see solutions happening on their property, they feel a lot more confident about implementing data to make changes. And again, back to that piece about interpreting data, help with interpreting data to make decisions. And that farmer to farmer information network, I think everyone here is involved in this in some capacity, but just continuing the building of bridges between different producers and allowing them to kind of problem solve together rather than us being the expert top-down approach, right? So just continuing that work, which I know that most of us are invested in. Funding was big. That's not a surprise to you. I'm sure people wanted money to do things. But in some more nuance to that category was also timing of things like grants and loan programs. What I would hear over and over and over again is that that's great that they're making money available, but I need this money now. And I can't actually, buy the equipment, wait for the process to go through, buy the equipment and have it work for this season. And people sometimes felt like the season is all I have. If I don't make this work, I might not be here. So timing and timeliness of programs was a big one. An interesting potential solution I found to that was to introduce something like retroactive compensation for out-of-pocket investments. So folks recommended, if I have to install, a LIPA system, for example, I do it out of pocket, why not have it so that if I can exhibit that I have increased my water efficiency, I can get retroactive compensation or reimbursement. And that would help with that timeline question. There was also a call to use grants and loans to reward good practices instead of just funding projects for people that haven't made these changes yet. That could be in the form of tax breaks, that could be in the form of mostly tax breaks was what people recommended. But that was considered something that would really encourage a positive relationship between funding agencies and farmers, is to reward good practices as opposed to just helping people that haven't made the changes yet. And some other benefits could be, expediting applications for grants if you have good standing, or updating water rights. This is very controversial, and rewarding them based on good practices rather than seniority. Okay, and I'm seeing that I am almost at time. So just quickly with policy, and then I'll be done. All farm policy, more immediate conversations about conflicting uses, including farmers in discussions more intentionally, and especially in legislative decisions. Things like market-related support, maybe like a drought efficiency sticker if you create a product using drought safe practices, and just more encouragement of positive press in the general public of things farmers are doing to mitigate drought and heat in a sustainable way. So I'll just give my key takeaways. A lot of it's kind of, like be compassionate, which you all know. So I'll just skip over that. And the last one is the QR code, which Carly already shared. It's for the QR page that has the full report plus kind of a visually appealing representation of everything we talked about today. So thank you so much. Sorry, I went over a couple minutes, and I'll leave it at that. Whew.
Thank you so much, Berit.
Yeah.
So there's some questions that have come in during your talk, and feel free to add more. We have about 8 minutes for questions.
Oh, great.
The first one is from Penny, sharing, how does NVivo compare to other qualitative analysis tools like Deduce?
Yeah, I did see that originally come in, and I have to be honest with you, Penny, I've mostly only used NVivo. That's just because that's what I was trained in and I'm most comfortable with it. So I would love to learn more about Deduce from you. But yeah, I'm not sure how they would compare because I've really only used the one system over my career.
There's a question, there's some comments too. I'm just going to start with the questions. Victoria asks, how many of the farmers interviewed currently have soil moisture monitoring equipment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we didn't use a quantitative survey to kind of say check if you're using these strategies. The kind of framework that we use is grounded theory, which basically means people talk about what's of interest to them, and that's how we kind of assess what's most important. And when folks talk about soil moisture monitoring, this is anecdotal and it's not a firm answer, but it's a small percentage. People are using it, but again, it goes back to that. We tried it. There's just way too much variability on our property. We weren't sure what to do with the data. The exception to that actually is the folks that participated in the Dry Farming Collaborative's work that Maud was a part of, where I think that you guys helped them look at the data, figure out what they needed to do based on that. And those folks felt like it was really helpful, but people that weren't involved in that initiative had said, basically, we've tried it, we're using it, but it's not something people are heavily relying on at the moment.
Great.
Yeah.
Sarah Miller has a comment that we can't assume existing programs are available to all producers. There are many barriers to existing programs, such as land tenure or financing options.
Sure. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, and I would love to hear more about kind of which programs. I don't know if we have the time to do that, maybe in a breakout group, but yeah, let's have more conversations about that, about which programs are accessible to people, which aren't, and what are those barriers, because that's absolutely true. If you're renting, which more and more people are, yeah, you might not have the same options as people that own their property, for sure.
It looks like there are not a ton of questions. So if Sarah, if you want to unmute and just make a brief comment, if you feel like that, if you're considering unmuting. Sarah also had another comment about this had to do with, I think, digging more wells was when the comment came in. Groundwater levels are not being monitored in most places, and trends can change rapidly.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that was kind of, I wish I had more time. Well, we'll talk about this in the groups, but that communication piece, right? And if there is data available, being really clear about it. And if there's not, also being really clear about it would be really useful. I think sometimes producers feel like they get told no without really having it explained to them why. And that doesn't really foster great relationships with people. And so even just explaining to people why it's so hard to monitor groundwater levels, right? And bringing them into the conversation about like, we're trying, but these are some of the obstacles we're facing. I mean, I think that can go a long way. I know Abigail's in the room too. And as someone who also works on water, we've heard that at quite a few different, meetings and groups of, be honest with us, like tell us what you know and tell us what you don't know. And that's okay. So yeah, I think that's a great point.
Awesome. So just to point you all that there's a cool conversation happening amongst a few folks around making some great equipment available, like roller crimpers. Someone up in Whatcom County, they have a drill, a spreader, poultry processing equipment. So there's a nice little chat happening around shared equipment if you want to get involved in that conversation. And then we do have a manure spreader. So from Lisa, another question. You mentioned that for composting and mulching, there was a need for equipment. What type of equipment would be necessary?
Yeah, so spreaders, and maybe I misspoke. I apologize if I did, but I think it was more the actual kind of compost and like the actual materials that you would be putting down. So there's a lot of farmers, in the Corvallis area that get like the leaf drop from the city, for example. But if you're in much more rural places like in Eastern Oregon, there's not as much of kind of that urban waste stream coming out. So that specifically is where that request came from, is maybe like some little seed money grants for businesses to start things like local but rural composting and mulching facilities that farmers can then access. So that's more of an issue in really rural areas than it is in kind of suburbs or semi-urban areas.
Cool. So there's some great resources in the chat. Maria has the link to the final statewide needs assessment. Carly put in Berit Beating the Heat. And Emmerich made a comment that these slides will be available to you in resources, and I'm sure there's other links we can get up there as well. Rihanna is saying to email her. She's got her email in the chat if you're interested in an effort around equipment rental programs from districts. And then a comment from D, good to hear about municipal leaf litter already being used by farmers. Thought of that as a potential solution. We do have another minute or so if folks have more questions. Great. Michael says, based on your findings, is there a broad awareness of the various available incentives? And the issue is more related to the accessibility of incentives.
I would have to think about that a little bit about, how aware do I think people are? Maybe this isn't going to answer your question directly, but I'll try my best. I mean, folks are very aware of things like the EQIP program. That's not something that people are like, oh, EQIP, what is that? They know what it is. They know that there is availability of funds. But I think that in terms of accessibility, a lot of folks felt like, again, that timing issue is a problem. I had a guy say, that's great, there's a cost share. I still can't afford my portion of the cost. So that doesn't help me, right? So there are a lot of folks that feel like, yeah, we do know what the resources are, but the way that they're kind of formatted is not really helpful to me, particularly in regards to how much funding is available, what they're willing to fund. Like I kept going back to the equipment piece, and how much is being offered, right? Because people still can't necessarily make that 30% or whatever it is. I don't know if that answered your question.
Great. Well, we're right about at time. Thank you so much, Berit. That was awesome. Lots of information packed in a very short time.
Yeah, sorry about that.
And I'll pass it over to Jessie to introduce Jessie.
Thanks, Maud. So I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Jessie Nichols, founder of the CAMPO Collective and co-owner of Stone Boat Farm. Jessie is a lifelong student of agroecology and advocate for radical change in our food and agricultural systems. He has learned from many communities in Latin America, from southern Mexico to rural Argentina, Guatemala, Cuba, and Nicaragua. CAMPO is a nonprofit farm and agroecology education center focused on regenerative systems development and producing food for efforts to fight food insecurity in the Hillsborough area. So I'll turn over to you, Jessie.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you to ORCAN for inviting me to speak and for doing an article on us that is posted on the ORCAN website. We're a group that's been in existence for as long as I've been farming, which is 10 years, but it's really only been the past 3 years that CAMPO Collective has been a small cooperative farm, and we've taken on a larger role in our local community, doing things like working with the food bank and providing food to Western farm workers, distribution of food to people experiencing food insecurity, the most of whom actually are farm workers who can't afford to buy quality food, which is a pretty great irony about the economic system that we live in. And that is one of the things that CAMPO tries to address directly. Let me see if I can share my screen while I put this. Slideshow up. Can people see what I'm doing here?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so there's 4 out of the 6 of us that are involved on a 2-acre project here now on Stoneboat Farm, which is a farm that my family has had for 10 years. And our goal is to use no-till practices and permaculture practices to build an environmentally sustainable form of agriculture on this small piece of land, and also to invite people who come from backgrounds working in conventional agriculture to form a cooperative farm wherein we do a profit share after deciding collectively what to spend any profit from each season's vegetable sales on to advance the farm. So I really liked being here for Berit's presentation. And I wanted to comment a couple things to sort of tie the 2 presentations together. You know, 2 of the issues that make us consider the importance of climate resilience and people-centric agriculture are drought and heat. Out here, we've known the whole time we've been farming that we live in the era of climate change, given the heat that we work in every summer and the unpredictable weather across the board. So our no-till strategy has a lot to do with building a lot of different aspects of soil health, but one is water holding capacity. One advantage we have here is that we have a tilled organic vegetable farm right next to this 2-acre no-till project. And that is one thing that we definitely saw quite significantly, is that water holding capacity just in the 3 seasons we've been doing no-till has greatly increased. So we water a whole lot less, and the crops remain just as healthy. So I also wanted to mention something that I always like to tell people. One of my favorite vegetables these days is sunchokes. The more that I've learned about it, and knowing that it's a native crop to North America, and now that I've got multiple seasons growing it and integrating it into the CAMPO project, and we've even come up with cool recipes to integrate it into Latin American cuisine and such, is that sunchokes are a great example of a crop that produces a lot of nutrient-rich food with very little inputs, because being native to here, it grows we don't fertilize it, we water it very little, and it makes an impressive plant that's full of food. So a good lesson from nature. And then heat, at every year, you know, farm workers die from heat stroke in the fields. And from our perspective, especially when comparing agriculture, how it's practiced here to how it's practiced in the places where CAMPO Collective members are from, we really often realize that this is caused more than anything by a social and economic structure in which farm owners maintain inhumane working conditions. So people are out there because, you know, working in dangerous environments like heat that's that intense, because they are being paid very little, oftentimes being paid by how much they can pick. So they're working strenuous work in unhealthy conditions. And it's not because that work necessarily needs to be done. You know, like our community would probably eat without each of those blueberries going into each of those baskets, or whatever it may be. But we have an economic structure in which lots of times people are sending people out there to make as much profit as they can and paying them as little as they can to do so. So that will end up in dangerous scenarios for farm workers. So part of our response to that is the creation of a cooperative structure in which we're able to focus on the well-being of each of our members. And without the incentive to exploit each other for profit, we can easily take days off and ensure that our working pace and conditions are safe when we have climate change issues to deal with, like extreme heat. So one of the main things that we like to focus on when we talk about what we do is the concept of food sovereignty, which according to the Via Campesina, which is an international peasants movement, which it's the word campesino in English or in Spanish, which translates to peasant in English, but has a pretty different meaning. It has a very positive meaning in Spanish. And I feel like sometimes we think of like feudal times or something when we say peasant in English, but it is the word that it translates to. So sometimes I use it interchangeably with the word campesino. But it's the right of local communities to control their own food systems. So peasant agroecology is food sovereignty in action. And it is a very political action. You know, we are making choices with the way we're making political choices when we choose how we grow our food. So agroecology requires us to challenge and transform structures of power in society. It puts the control of seeds, biodiversity, land and territories, waters, knowledge, culture, and the commons in the hands of people who feed the world, drastically reducing external inputs from agribusinesses, rejecting agrochemicals and artificial hormones, GMOs, synthetic biology, and other corporate technologies that undermine people's well-being and food sovereignty. So agroecology produces for local markets, thereby helping communities de-link from global corporate value chains. And I think I've got the statistic. Maybe I don't have it on here, but it's one that the Via Campesina always cites, which is that about 70% of the food in the world is still produced by campesinos, by very small scale agricultural producers growing in ways that are often influenced or continuations of indigenous growing practices that have been practiced for tens of thousands of years in those regions, and small scale producers going to markets and feeding people. It's often not calculated in a lot of the data that we'll hear, but you know, they do that with about a third of the world's cultivatable lands. So it is still the way that the world feeds itself more so than the big agribusiness corporations that have taken 2/3 of the arable lands to produce 30% of what the world actually eats, if you take the entire world into consideration. And so the industrial food system is one of the main drivers of global warming, whereas peasant agroecology and food sovereignty reduce emissions by keeping many fossil fuels underground, adapting to climate changes, and realizing social justice. Agroecology and food sovereignty are social, political, and ecological visions that challenge business as usual and create systems of shared control over the requirements of life. So CAMPO is an attempt on our small 2 acres of land that we've been using so far to put those values of that larger organization, the Via Campesina, into practice on a small scale, but with the bigger picture in mind. So we, of course, are trying to establish a different type of power relations instead of those that you see in place in industrial agribusiness, in which a small set of corporations seek to expand private profits, including through financialization of nature, and I would expand that to not just talking about industrial agribusiness, but also talking about all of the different businesses that are using land that could be used for agriculture, that could be getting a lot more people onto the land and practicing sustainable careers in agriculture. For example, here we have, and that's actually another good tie-in to Berit's presentation. We have data centers going in all around us. We're trying to prevent them from going in pretty much across the street from our farm here. There's a petition that I'll try to share to the group as well later, but they use like 5 million gallons of water per day each, and they are adding a whole lot, and it really makes you question what the values of our society are when we're taking farmland away from farmers and putting it into such a consumptive industry. So I think in addition to just the damages of industrial agribusiness, lots of times even like a big conventional farm, I would way rather see as my neighbor than a lot of what it is being replaced with in lots of regions that are sort of exurban or on the urban boundary like we are. And as its contrast to those types of land use practices and business practices, peasant agroecology is practiced by small scale food producers. And it's really important that we create urban and rural allies to that movement, and also other allies across the agricultural sector like we're doing now. So we can seek to meet human needs by collaborating with nature. And so as I was just saying, the most environmentally destructive forms of conventional agriculture are tied to exploitative social practices, treating both the land and people as means of profit. They have to be addressed simultaneously, in our opinion. We can do a lot to look at the existing structure and try to make it more sustainable. But if we're not looking to change the social and economic structures that cause so much environmental damage, it's really hard to kind of fit a square peg in a round hole and make those structures just become more environmentally sustainable, because it's not their business model. So CAMPO organizes farm workers from conventional farming backgrounds into cooperative sustainable social structures. And a point that I wanted to make about that actually is that the people in CAMPO all come from the other than myself, everybody else comes from situations in Latin America where they have farmed for many years. Their families have a lot of experience, and CAMPO is a practice of learning from them and sharing a lot of knowledge from a population that's often viewed as just farm workers, but oftentimes they could be, we're missing out on a whole bunch of valuable knowledge. So the practices that we tried to integrate into our farm include no tillage, deep compost mulching, permaculture. We have a lot of perennials planted in with our annuals. We're working on integration of goats and egg-laying chickens, rotating back and forth between animal pastures and vegetable pastures, and of course, cooperation, as I mentioned in our model. Here's that quote that I mentioned earlier, but just to drive it home, this is from the Via Campesina. 75% of agricultural resources used worldwide are used by industrial agriculture, and peasant farmers, meanwhile, are feeding 70% of the world's population. So that's why we can look to people like so many people who have had to come here because of the economic practices of this country in Latin America, which has made farming unviable in so many places across this hemisphere by pushing industrial agriculture into countrysides where it wasn't before. But we can look to a lot of people who come from those places and learn how their families have been feeding the world, and people in campesinos have been feeding the world for many years. And so our goal is to kind of create space for methods of production similar to those. And solidarity with those projects worldwide is very key to our project. So this is a quote from the Via Campesina as well. Land redistribution to small farmers, combined with policies to rebuild soil fertility and promote local markets, can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by half within a few decades. And just since I've got a minute and a half left before my little presentation is over here, I threw in this picture of a place that my girlfriend Montse and I visited earlier this year. This is the Agricultural Institute in Nicaragua. And Nicaragua is another great example of agroecology in practice. This Association of Rural Workers promotes all types of agricultural practices across Nicaragua, working with a lot of small farmers and giving them free education and promoting really healthy, sustainable agricultural practices. And at the same time, building a really strong network of farmers who have a political strength and power in understanding their value as the people who feed their nation. And in Nicaragua, it's more true than almost anywhere else on the planet that they feed their whole nation, because it's around 90% food sovereign in Nicaragua. So it's a place where most food is local. And I think it's a great example to look to. So I felt like it would be a good closing slide to throw in a photo from their school, which also invites people internationally. It's a wonderful place to go and visit and learn about agroecology. So
Thank you so much, Jesse. That was amazing, really inspiring work. And there are lots of nice comments in the chat complimenting you. The one specific question I'm seeing is around deep composting. If you could talk about what you mean by that.
Yeah, we are actually working on building a different type of composting system. What we started doing it with purchased compost from Recology here in North Plains, but to be honest, we haven't been super thrilled with the quality of that compost. We have to sift through it for trash residue and stuff like that pretty regularly, which isn't great. But our first idea was to do deep compost mulching, which is inspired by Frith Farm in Maine. Daniel Mays has a whole book on that, on his strategy, which you can start your beds and get no-till beds a lot closer to the way higher organic matter level that no-till farming depends on pretty quickly by adding like 1 to 2 inches of compost layers on top of your beds before planting. And then we do wood chip pathways in between each bed there. And so it's just a whole lot of organic matter on top of the soil, covering up and building a pretty different soil pretty quickly. But now what we want to move towards is inspired by Jen Aaron. We went and visited her farm not too long ago, and she makes compost that is similar to what's made in Johnson Sioux bioreactor composters. So we're going to start building some of those, and you can apply a whole lot less. Once you've kind of got your organic matter up a little bit higher, you can kind of just keep kickstarting the biology with a really more biologically rich compost made in those types of composting methods. So we're in a transition, but I think I would say deep compost mulch, if you have a way to get a whole lot of compost, it's a pretty good way to start no-till vegetable beds.
Great, thanks. Just wanted to point to a comment in the chat from Sarah about a Rogue Farm Corps is conducting a survey to gauge interest in collaborative farming models. And it looks like today is the last day to fill in the survey. So she's got a link. If you scroll up in the chat, maybe we could put it in so people can find it easily. But that would be great for folks to respond to that survey if you're interested in that. And then we have kind of some questions around this collective model. and hearing about maybe some other examples. Yeah, also from Sarah, it would be helpful to learn more about what movements and approaches are out there to challenge that rapid financialization of agricultural land. You talked a little bit, but maybe if you have other examples, or if folks in the Zoom room, if you want to add anything to the chat, if you're familiar with any examples of movements or approaches that are challenging that.
We've done actually 2 documentary events out here on our land with CAMPO, and we try to do educational events and events in solidarity with different movements around the world. One organization that we've focused on several times is called the Landless Movement in Brazil, the Landless Peasants Movement, often called as well, the MST for its initials in Portuguese. They are facing much more extreme version, you know, in lots of parts of Brazil, of the same economic structure, a neoliberal capitalist economic structure, moving in and taking pretty much all the land that thousands of people used to depend on. They have a method of occupying unused lands that are bought and held by corporations, mostly for their financialized speculative value. You know, or they're holding them and saying, oh, we're going to eventually graze cows on there, you know, that there'll be a lot of different excuses that the corporations give. But from the perspective of those communities, you know, that's their livelihood, and it's the potential of them being able to continue living in the places they've always lived. So they have actually gotten the Brazilian government, especially now under Lula. It started when Lula was in, or yeah, I believe it started when Lula was in power. And then now that he's back in power, lots of times they convince the government to change those lands over into communally legally owned lands by farmers who take the land back from those types of structures. So that's one. We're not there yet in the United States, but you know, maybe if we could find some ways to start organizing before we get to that extreme of an example. I think a lot of other types of cooperative structures that exist in other parts of Latin America, across Mexico. If you go to the Via Campesina website, you can look region by region at a whole lot of different movements and organizations across the world that are doing the same type of work from this perspective in different ways, depending on the needs of their situations.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm assuming your website is, maybe Emmerich, you could throw that in the chat too, so people can find it easily. We have a couple more follow-up questions on the compost. Ryan asks, is that like worm compost or compost teas and the like? And then D is also asking again for the name, to name the type of compost models Gen A is using and CAMPO is working to replicate. And you mentioned someone's name, I didn't catch it, but maybe we could get that in the chat too for folks.
Yeah, it's Johnson Sue. I believe it's like that. Johnson Sue biocomposters. I tried to just put it in the chat. But if you look it up, it's the last names of the people that invented it, I think, Johnson and Sue, and they it's sort of a stacking compost function, though. A lot of people do it with fencing that they wrap into a barrel, and then they put weed mat surrounding it. That's like the one that Jen has. And then you put aeration tubes of PVC usually down into the middle. We're going to make them out of IBC tote cages. So the square cages that hold the big water tanks, but just the cage part. And then we're going to put 4-inch PVCs in the middle with holes in them. And then leaf matter is a really good ingredient for that. Animal manure. So when our animals overwinter in barns, we'll save up the chicken and goat manures and add those into that compost along with certain amounts of vegetable scraps and wood chips. But you know, it's about the ratio, and it's about that really aerated and then the stacking structure that you use, that makes it a really healthy, biologically rich compost.
Cool. Okay. You're getting some gratitude for that answer. We're getting micro and macro questions for you. How do we overcome lack of access to land so that farm workers can begin forming collectives? Big question. Just wondering if you see any emerging opportunities.
That is a huge question. And I think of what CAMPO is doing, like I struggled with that a lot, you know, being in a position where my family has this much land. You know, I've chosen to work with the folks that I'm working with, you know, largely inspired by their ideas and through conversations about collective agriculture that came from their ideas as much as from mine. But, you know, we came up with that concept together that, you know, I'm in a position to share this land, and then my goal is to put it in an agricultural trust. The portion of this farm that will end up being my property, you know, will be transferred into a agricultural trust and then maintained by the cooperative in perpetuity is the goal. Still trying to figure out how exactly that's going to work. But things like that can happen. And I don't think that's the best strategy for land redistribution, you know, but it's what I can do. Maybe it would become something that would be a bigger part of our collective consciousness if more people who do have access to land started to do sort of a voluntary distribution of their land in that sort of way as a transition strategy for when they know they're going to be done farming, transitioning it to a cooperative of their farm workers. It's one way that it can happen, but I do think what we need is much larger scale transition. And so I think it's simultaneously that, and also conversations and organizing among farm workers and other people who are in solidarity with them.
Awesome. We just have a minute left. There's a question about your transition to no-till, how fertility was impacted, and then kind of a related question, a bit more about how some of the other soil health practices you mentioned have supported climate resilience. So if you want to try to answer those two questions in a minute, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
You can take a couple extra minutes. I think we're fine.
Okay. Yeah. I'd say fertility was impacted in, even from the first season, a manner that I would say is very positive. Even in our first year no-till growing here, it's a little hard to say super definitively because we started on a field that we had only cover cropped before, and also a field that we knew was the field with the lowest quality soils on our farm. So those are two considerations that made it different from the other soil on the farm whose fertility we're monitoring. But we, from the beginning, applied in our first year probably around a third of as much fertilizer as we apply per row foot on the tilled farm, and still had yields that were probably, you know, and the things that worked. We also had definite failures, things that didn't work, but for a variety of reasons, as always in farming, right? But when we figured out how to grow a crop with these methods, the yields are probably around 2/3 of what we get on the tilled farm at this point, 3 years down the line. And now we use probably even slightly less than a third of as much powdered fertilizer. But we also do use, we got soil inoculants for microbial and fungal health from a company called Advancing Ecological Agriculture. And so before transitioning any of the land that we now use for the no-till operation, we use those liquid inoculants that I've seen results from. I do think that feeding the soil microbes and fungi through those liquids is pretty effective. So those were great ways to jumpstart that biology, and then just that added organic matter. Those little guys can eat it up and turn it into soil with a better structure that can hold on to nutrients, and as well as water and air, like I was mentioning earlier. And then the other practices like the permaculture, we've got hedgerows in front of the annual rows here that are fruit trees, and we're working on filling in under the fruit trees with native pollinator attractant plants. And we're gonna, in the long run, that big hedgerow that we're putting in is going to vary back and forth between fruit trees and native trees and native bushes and ones that are focused around the native bees and insect life. So I would say that's probably the main sustainability benefit that we get from those practices of integrating the perennials in is having a place for predator insects to live through the winter so that their populations stick around. On the big farm, on the big tilled organic farm here, we buy in a lot of bugs, because they don't have many places to go every year. Or we have the riparian area that we restored that is a good place for them, but they need more space, like within the amount of space that we have for a lot of them that don't fly as far, et cetera. So I think that's going to be one of the big long-term benefits of that other practice. And the animal integration is still pretty new for us. We have not, we still have our egg-laying chickens and our couple little goats separate from the rest of the farm. So that is rotating them and rotating back and forth between their pasture and the vegetable land is going to start next season if we manage to get it all set up before next season gets started. So
cool.
But that is one of the things that comes very directly from the experience of CAMPO members in different parts of Latin America, where animal integration is pretty standard in a lot of small scale campesino farmers practices down there.
Cool. Thank you so much again, Jesse. And there's other great resources in the chat if you want to check it out. And I will turn it over to Carly.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse. It was really awesome to hear about all of the different things that are happening at the CAMPO Collective. It's an exciting project. So we're going to talk about the transition into breakout rooms. Last session we did by region, and this session we're going to do by practice. So I'm going to run through our community agreements and what you need to know to get started. So you can find your topical worksheet in the participant agenda, both in your registration email reminder and also in the chat, if that can be dropped in. Please use your worksheet to read about the goals and discussion questions that both presenters shared with us and apply it towards your topic. You all pre-selected topics in your registration, but you're gonna select those yourself. Emmerich will tell you more about that process. So once you're in your groups, please remember to assign a facilitator and a note taker for your group. If you take notes, it'll really help us to inform future programming and trainings. So for our community agreements, I just like to remind everyone to make space for each other. If you notice you're speaking more than others in your breakout room, please step back and wait for others to share. Please respect one another and listen to understand. Let's call each other in, not out. Everyone makes mistakes. A growth mindset helps us to learn from one another. Breakout rooms will not be recorded. They are meant for you to process, discuss, and network with your community. If you need any tech support, please direct message Emmerich for assistance. I'll now pass it over to Emmerich to share more about the logistics. So Andrew, feel free to share when you're ready.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. My name is Andrew Collins Anderson, and I work for the Oregon Community Food Systems Network. Y'all can see that?
Yep.
Is that good? Okay.
That's good.
Great. I work for the Oregon Community Food Systems Network, and I am the coordinator of a working group called Farming for the Future. We work with service providers and allies to support beginning underserved small farmers across the state, and we do that on a couple different levels, supporting land access work, climate resilience work, farm viability, and beginning farmer and rancher support. And OCFSN in 2021 was awarded money for a 2022 season for disaster relief funding and successfully administered $1.5 million to producers who had losses in their operation from climate disasters. With that successful program, we went back to the legislature with partners, Friends of Family Farmers, ORCAN, and others across the food system to advocate for more funding to create a disaster resilience program for these farmers. And that money was rewarded. We've got $2.65 million for the biennium, the next 2 years for this program. And we're in the middle of the process right now of developing this new grant program, and we're going to be announcing it in the next month. So y'all are getting a sneak peek of what we're preparing for here and getting set up for our producers and for all the folks that you work with. So this is still a work in progress. What I'm going to share today, it could change, but for the most part, this is where we've landed. So we got $2.65 million for these disaster resilience grants. It's funded by the state, managed by Oregon Community Food System Network, and OCFSN is contracting Friends of Family Farmers for some of their our administrative support for this program. So it's a team effort. ORCAN's been on the advisory committee. OSU has been involved in the process, and the Center for Small Farms and Community Food Systems. So it's a team effort, as we do at the network. Some of the main goals of the program is to keep barriers to access low. We've extensively referenced the Beat the Heat report that Berit presented on today, and we're hearing a lot of those findings and incorporating them into this grant program. You know, nonprofits like ourselves get this grant program because we can be responsive, quick, and get the money turned around really fast. We got the money in we got the signed bill and the money allocated in August, and then we're going to have that money available. Hopefully, we're going to start applications in January of this next year. So we're trying to be really quick. Anyways, focusing on direct outreach to underserved farmers and small farmers, we're going to be providing really personalized support for applicants. So applicants can call, and we give them support on their applications, trying to be really helpful in that way. We'll have office hours and webinars to educate farmers on what's available here. There's 2 different pools we're setting up. We're going to have a smaller pool and a larger pool, trying to get as much money to as many farmers as possible, but also hearing that these smaller grants aren't necessarily as impactful. So creating another pool of some larger grants to really be offering some more impactful dollars for some more powerful resilience. And then our list of strategies that we put on for this resilience strategies on farm advised from the Beat the Heat report, a farmer and expert advisory committee. We're really reaching out to the community to shape this program and have it be as impactful as possible. So the current timeline for this year, January 1st, 2024, we're going to open up applications. Applications close after 2 months. Awards announced in April, and then funds delivered by the end of April, with about a year for the producers to implement their resilience strategies on farms. So we're trying to make that as equitable as possible, giving enough time for applicants, and then also enough time to complete the projects. If they're unable to do it during like peak season, they have that next winter to implement them. And so it's 2 rounds. Second round would be in 2025. Generally, for qualifying for a grant like this, for this grant, you would need to be deriving some farm income off of your farm, being a small farmer, using that USDA $350,000 farm income number. We're going to be prioritizing BIPOC, drought-impacted environmental justice identifying producers. We'll be reviewing project budgets and farm budgets, especially for those larger grants. And then there's some really not too difficult, but there will be some reporting requirements for producers in order for us to show the impact of these dollars and request more for future grants for this work. And then, you know, we've had folks from all over the state, folks from different communities, producers that are vegetable producers, seed producers, livestock, all advising on the program to kind of make sure we're hitting all the needs and issues across the state and across those production systems. And then also ORCAN has been involved in that, and then the OSU Center for Small Farms and Community Food Systems. So again, a really quality group of folks, and just want to highlight that Beat the Heat report was really essential in putting this together. Just the categories for the grant would be for on-farm strategies, irrigation and water efficiency, shading and cooling, soil health, ecosystem management, other crop management, purchase of rental of equipment that directly results in or supports on-farm resilience, planning and monitoring research. It's an extensive list, and you'll be able to see that when we release the grant. And to stay in the loop as this comes out, FOF has a survey on their website, right on their homepage, friendsofamilyfarmers.org. You can go and make some comments on what you hear the need is from the folks you work with, and then sign up for their newsletter. Sign up, ORCAN will have it. We'll all be putting out in our newsletters and online when this all is live and ready to go. So just stay tuned, and yeah, super excited to be working on this opportunity and this support for farmers to be more climate resilient. I think that's it.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your shares. There were a few comments. I don't think we don't really have time. We're over time as it is right now. But if you could touch really quickly on who underserved farmers is.
We have a definition. It will be defined when we release the grant. Great.
I think that will do it. So in closing today's session, thank you everyone for participating. It was a really great webinar. I'm really happy with all of the speakers and all the opportunities we had to learn from one another. We're going to have our final and third session next week, Wednesday, same time, 9:30 to 11:30. And everybody who's registered will get that email registration or confirmation and reminder next Tuesday with all of the necessary agendas and information so that you can be ready for next week. So thank you again to everyone. If we could drop the survey in the chat real quick, we'll also send that in the following email with resources, slides, and the feedback survey that'll come out either today or later tomorrow. So I guess we'll just close out and you'll get that survey tomorrow. There it is. If you still are here, you can grab that, and we appreciate your thoughts. It's just 2 questions. Thank you again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.